and let's talk about what's going on with podcasting, how you can get started, and why this is such an amazing medium. So let's talk about podcasting. And Timi, at Acast, you guys do a lot of research on what's going on here. So just give it a little taste. You recently released some about what the current state is here in Asia.
Yes, and thanks for having us. Good morning, everyone. So Acast is about 5 months in the market, although we've been around for 10 years around the world. And so when we came to Singapore, we wanted to give people a better understanding of what podcasting was and what the listener base is. Because, like you said, it's in your ear, so it's invisible. So it's very hard for people to understand if they don't listen to it. And what we found is it basically matches what we see everywhere else in the world, where podcasting is already like a mainstream revenue-generating channel for creators. You have like the most focused audience. You have people listening for like 1 to 2 hours a day. People are connected to like 5 podcasts on average. Like on a weekly basis, they might be fans of that and regularly listen. And so it also, of course, like creates a better environment for advertisers.
Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting is it is not I'm bored for a couple minutes, let's doom scroll on my vertical video. It's more YouTube-esque in the way that you seek out the content that you want. But I think it's even more a thing where you make time in your week to connect with the podcast that you love, which is very different from, I'm going to go up on YouTube and see what my creators are into, or I'm just going to doom scroll on TikTok or Shorts or Reels. So I think that model is really important to keep in mind because it has so much power. So Dan, you've been podcasting for a few years now here in Asia. What was it like when you got started, and contrast that to what it's like today?
I mean, hello? It's all good?
I think you're good.
Yeah, so I think when we started in 2020, I think the reason why we wanted to take this leap into podcasting, because at that point of time, I think we owned about 2 or 3 different YouTube channels or different media channels, but we didn't do a podcast yet. And it was because we started to see that shift into podcasts, especially in the region. One was that we started seeing more people here locally watch podcasts like Joe Rogan, for example. And to us, that was really interesting because for a long time, we always thought that we needed to keep content short. We needed content to be 5 minutes, 10 minutes was like, whoa. And when I think people started listening to like podcasts like Joe Rogan, like I mentioned, it kind of made it easier. It kind of lowered the barrier of entry because people are getting used to listening to 1 hour, 2 hours of essentially what was a talk show. That was what people were familiar with. And then we started seeing more Asian creators also branch into podcasting. So I think like Genie Boy, for example, massive like YouTuber in Malaysia, started its own podcast as well. And so then we started to look at these trends and go, okay, I think there's going to be more appetite for it here. I think people are starting to get used to it, and so that's why we started our podcast, and the growth was faster than any other media brand that we created. Yeah.
Talk about the podcast that you do and the podcast that you do at the company.
Yeah, so it's called a Daily Ketchup, and so we basically talk about many different topics, which is quite strange because a lot of podcasts that do well tend to be niches, right? But we tend to talk about stuff that is relatable to the ordinary person, or in particular the ordinary Singaporean. So we can touch about things like current affairs or policies, new policies that come out. We might talk about relationships, maybe about sex, maybe about random shower thoughts that we might have had that someone might find relatable. And so even the topics that we've done, it ranges so widely. Like we've had a series on religion, for example, so we brought different religious leaders to come down and talk about their faith, but also for us being morons, talking about really dumb questions like have you seen a fellow monk naked before? That kind of thing where no one thinks of asking. But and then from there, we have also had the opportunity to interview ministers and also other random people. Like we've interviewed a mosquito expert, and that turned out to be one of a really beloved episode by fans.
Yeah, and I think the point about long form is really important because these are, half hour, even longer experiences, which is really interesting. In the US, where podcasting's been around for a long time, as it has other parts of the world, a lot of the growth we found was in people driving to work in cars. And there's less of that now, although we're coming back from the pandemic. But what's the listener experience and model like in Asia? How are people consuming it Timi, I'll start with you. How are people consuming podcasts here?
There is a bit of the commute there, but of course it's not like the States or Australia where you really have long drives. But there is that, and then people actually listen at home, people listen on errands, people listen when they're walking the dog. So imagine it as the places in your day when you might not want or need a screen, but you still want something stimulating, something entertaining, something that fills your day. And because it is mindful, you're not just doom scrolling. You are open to something that, might not be your usual kind of just comedy content or something funny, some meme. It's a lot deeper.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself listening to podcasts when I'm cooking or other sort of rote things where my brain is engaged but not as much, so I can actually give a big portion of it over to the podcast that I'm listening to.
Yes, which is also why, like, even formats-wise, there are the long-form shows, but then you also have really successful shows that are 10, 15 minutes long. And we like to say that because creators are always worried, like, oh, do I really have to do an hour every day? Which, you don't have to. Like, there are no rules. So you can have formats of any length. You can be a talk show, you can be narrative. We have, like, a couple of true crime and horror shows coming on. Like, it's really, like, a wide range.
So that would be, as you're going to bed, listen to some horror shows, right?
We have people listening to horror as soon as they wake up. Like, when we see the listening data on horror, I always wonder why someone would be listening to horror at 7 in the morning, but it happens.
It's like a cup of coffee. Daniel, what do you know about your listeners and where they listen and how they listen and what that behavior is like?
Yeah, so we're on two platforms. So we're on YouTube as well as audio, and Spotify being the most popular of that. And we've had different people come up to us and tell us where they listen to. So, like, for example, I know a couple of people that listen to it and they play in the background whenever they're doing house chores. And there are those that would listen to it while they are on their commute home or commute to work. But a really interesting group that multiple of them have actually come up to so we have 4 cast members, and they've come up to a few of us and tell us that they actually listen to it while they ride. So they are delivery drivers or riders. And so in Singapore, like, given that we really love convenience, food delivery is massive here, right? And so there are also a massive amount of food delivery riders. And so they've told us that they love listening to us either when they're waiting for an order or when they're in between deliveries, because it makes them feel as though they're just part of a group of friends just listening in the background. And so that was quite heartening to hear, yeah.
It's interesting. You talked about YouTube as a place where you put your podcast. Is it audio only, or is it a video podcast on YouTube?
So it's a video podcast on YouTube, and it's, an audio on
so
Spotify.
I think that's really interesting, thinking about this audio medium, but more and more it's going up on some of the video platforms. I know YouTube's making a big push into podcasts. Why is that, and what is the reason why you do an audio thing in video, and how do you think about that, and do you produce it differently because it's on video versus audio? Dive into that a little bit, and then Timi, I want to know what you think about the video trend as well.
For Daily Ketchup in particular, when we first started listening to them, we realized, actually they were already on YouTube first, which is another thing that creators can find useful as a case study, because depending on, again, the format of your show, and it's a conversation show, then if you watch them on YouTube and you listen to them on audio, you're not losing a lot. Right. And so there is that opportunity if your format is like that. But then we're also finding, especially with, say, journalism type podcasts, where they just need to be everywhere. And especially in this part of the world where you have listeners that are both urban and rural, video helps across all of that, but audio actually reaches more. In a way, it does replace radio, again, from a journalism standpoint. But then also, if you're Mark Maron and you're a comedy show, you're funny anywhere.
Right, yeah.
So that works too.
So Daniel, talk about how you think about video versus audio as you produce.
Yeah, so for us, it was really 2 main considerations. It was discoverability and it was stickiness in terms of, like, fan loyalty. So I think for us, in terms of discoverability, we felt that it was great to be on multiple platforms, but it was just easier to find, given that we had built YouTube channels before, we knew how to kind of play with the YouTube algorithm game. And so we knew what kind of titling works. We knew what kind of thumbnails worked. And so we knew that if we wanted to be discovered first, YouTube was our main plan. The other reason was because, like I mentioned, we have 4 cast members. 2 of them are popular because of other YouTube shows. And so that was just optimizing for that. And then in terms of stickiness, I always believe that it's it's relatively easier. It's not easy, but it's relatively easier to create one great episode because you just need a really, really good topic and title. But it's hard to create loyalty. It's hard to convert someone to subscribing. And that comes from building characters, from building personas. I mean, I think you do have to be yourself, but showing a true side of yourself that people then want to go, what does he think about this new topic? And when we are able to do that, we felt that the video format was just easier to do in terms of creating that character, because you get to see who we are, you get to see what we're like, and then when you do listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatnot, you can imagine who that person is speaking. And then I think the other reason why we wanted to be on both platforms was just in terms of the cross-platform mobility. So we've heard from our listeners that sometimes they'll be at home and then they need to leave. So they'll be listening to us on YouTube and then they'll just continue on Spotify. Or the other way around, they might be listening to us on Spotify, go, okay, I want to continue this, and then when they reach home, they just watch us on YouTube.
Yeah, I find from a production perspective, and I'm interested in both of yours thoughts on this, is that if you're producing something that you want to have be a podcast, but you still want to have it be video, you can't do a lot of visual gags on the video that the listeners don't get, because then they'll be like, why am I even listening to this if I don't really understand what's going on? Or, as I've found some podcasters do, when they do something that's a little bit more visual, they'll actually explain it and be like, okay, for you folks listening, this is what's going on. Daniel, are those things that you incorporate in your production process?
Very little of, and I'll explain why. I think the reason why we don't is because when people do listen on the audio version and feel like they're missing out, they then seek out the video version, and now we've duplicated a view. So
now you get multiple views for the same thing. Oh,
exactly that.
Hacking podcasts right here. I don't know. What do you think about the audio-video thing, Timi?
Actually, what we find is the podcasters who succeed is when they do something complementary rather than just replication. For example, we have a true crime show that's coming on in Taiwan, of all places, where apparently it's massive. And she obviously is audio first, podcast first, very well researched narrative. But then her Instagram is through the roof because it's herself connecting to her community. And so they use Instagram and the reels and all of that to have conversations that you don't necessarily have on audio, right? Because you don't have that that comment and that social component. And so that's how she uses it, and then it kind of becomes this virtuous cycle of here's how you grow, here's how you get word of mouth. And that's really important because podcasting is still very much a word of mouth driven growth channel.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about live. I think it's fascinating. 15 years ago, I ran a YouTube network, but we started out as a video podcasting network and a podcasting network. And one of our shows, Dig Nation, had a huge audience and a huge parasocial relationships. And we would go to South by Southwest, and they would do a live Dig Nation and get 3,000 people at Stubbs listening to it. I'm always fascinated by the connection that the audience has with some of these top podcasters, and the fact that even though it's mostly audio, they will go sit in a theater or outdoors at a big performance venue and listen to the folks do the podcast live. It's huge. Daniel, have you done your stuff live, and what has the response been? And then we can take it up, talk more in general, Timi.
So no, we haven't, but it's something that we've been exploring. So in fact, we've actually been speaking to a particular sponsor to actually start to be part of our first live show. And so that will still be in a studio. It's just going to be live streamed. And then we have another event coming up, I think in March, where we potentially might have our first ever live show on stage. But what we've done with different partners is that they've invited us to do panels such as this and essentially host that panel. So it's quite similar to a podcast, and it's been a great experience because I think it takes a very different amount of skill set. To be honest, with the Daily Ketchup, we do film more than we actually need, and so sometimes we do edit down some stuff, not to censor anything, but just for brevity. And so for us, just as speakers, to kind of self-edit on stage is quite a new process for us. So that was quite an interesting experience.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, work on it. Next year, CreatorWorld, maybe we'll invite you to come and do a live podcast.
Sounds
and see
good.
how it goes. We'll give you a stage and everything.
Sounds
Timi,
good.
talk about it more in general.
It's successful when you really have a community. And I think we're not just talking about podcasts, right? I think every creator in the room gets that. Like when you've built a community over however many months or years, then doing a live event is something that they will demand almost from you. We have another show that just finished, like a Halloween live recording another horror show. I don't know why there's a lot of them, but
Because it's near, we're close to Halloween, probably, right?
And so they, and they've been around for 18 months, about 1.5 million listens now. Yeah. And so, when they do a Halloween show, the tickets go like that. And then it's their peak.
How many people did they have at this show? You were telling me this earlier.
A few hundred.
A few hundred,
this one,
yeah.
But we have another partner who's like 5,000, fills out theaters and all
Wow,
of that.
5,000
But
people.
they're more professional in the way. They came from media, they came from radio. They've been doing this a lot longer.
But still, that's a big audience.
Yeah. And that's just Singapore.
Right.
We're not even talking about like the bigger markets in the region.
Interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the audio stuff that we saw pop up during COVID that kind of faded away a little bit. Clubhouse, we've got other things there. I mean, LinkedIn's still doing good audio and having fun with it, sort of competing with podcasts. Daniel, did you guys think about Clubhouse at all?
Yeah, so I think even before we started this podcast, we were thinking, what's our Clubhouse strategy? Because that was big, right? And we thought that was going to be something that we might miss out on. And I think when we started looking closely at what was doing well and what wasn't doing well, we felt that when you look at Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces, and things like that, it's successful if it's centered around some form of fandom. Right. So I think it's really good if either you're a really famous celebrity or if you're maybe a journalist that is talking about sports teams, or you might be a Web3 community or something like that. Then I think when it's based on communities or fandom, then you tend to do well because there's that stickiness, there's that need for... It's a little bit more time sensitive, so you need to be live as opposed to something that's a bit more evergreen, like a podcast format. So for us, we didn't feel like there was longevity there, and it tends to be a little bit of a close-knit group as well, which makes monetization a little bit harder.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they would bring guests up. I mean, Fireside was another platform that would bring guests up and do live podcasting, which during the lockdown, I could totally see it during COVID. But even as Jasper said when he opened up yesterday, and he was so happy that we were back face-to-face, and we're not Zooming, and we're not, we're all in the same room, I think it's a different experience. And so I think that might explain why some of these have fallen off a little bit. But I do still think there's something there, but I don't know. We'll see where it goes. What do you think about the whole Clubhouse-y thing?
I mean, it was great for a hot minute, and then I got really bored very quickly.
Yeah.
And it felt like Slack. On Slack, you can turn on Huddle and have like a work conversation.
Or Discord too.
Yeah, but Discord is entertaining. Slack is work. And I felt Clubhouse was becoming more like Slack
work.
And not Discord or Twitch or anything like that.
Timi, I want to talk a little bit about the size of the market. You did a study recently that had some pretty eye-popping figures in it. Like 1 in 5 in Asia Pacific listened to a podcast last week. It's amazing. Hours a week, et cetera. Pull off a couple of the really interesting things there that you saw in the study that it really is amazing amount of the podcast listening that's happening in Asia Pacific.
Yeah. So 1 in 5 on a weekly basis do it. Some markets are even higher. In terms of how focused they are, and we were talking about how mindful people are about listening to podcasts, they're actually more focused when listening to podcasts versus watching streaming TV or going on social media. And so what that also means is when you get to the monetization side and the advertising side, podcasts are unique in that you don't have as many ads on there, which means people aren't bombarded, so they're not turned off by it. And it also means that the attentiveness does translate to their receptiveness to ads. And at the same time, the job we have in the ecosystem is to make sure we protect that, and not turn it into something where you get ads every 5 minutes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about
off.
monetization now because I think it's a super interesting topic, particularly for creators, brands thinking of starting their own podcasts. So, Daniel, I'll start off with you. How do you think about, and are you monetizing, and what does it look like, and what are the ad formats, and what works, and maybe did you try stuff that didn't work?
Yeah, so we monetized the podcast in 3 formats, which were 2 of which were new to us because, like I mentioned, so on our other media brands, we do sponsored content, and that was the only way we did it. So it was entire sponsored episodes that looked like our organic, but it was brought to you by a different company, and sometimes we might partner with them to kind of influence a little bit of the content, but we retain creative control. On the podcast, we do 3 forms, so we still do sponsored episodes, but we've introduced sponsored plugs, which are 30 to 60 seconds long. And we also do product placements. So with sponsored episodes, I think for us, what we found that was different from our other media brands was that because we had a fixed format and there was a fixed flavor of the podcast, it was easier for us to kind of say, this is how we want to do it actually, and I think you should do it this way. And because they kind of knew the show and they've also listened, they were happy for us, like they being clients, they were happy for us to kind of take the lead on that. And so in terms of like a good case study for that, I think we worked with one of the big local banks here in Singapore, and they wanted to build an online community, for example. And I think had we done it on any other channel, it would have been very much, hey, these are the great reasons why you should join this online community, and maybe make it about a skit or make it comedic. But for us, we took a very soft-style approach. We actually talked about difficult conversations that you might have in a relationship. We started off the conversation by saying, well, I said, I know my money is her money, but it's her money, my money. I don't think so. So it was a bit provocative, but then that whole conversation led to difficult conversations in relationships amongst friends. And then, by the way, like if you want to continue conversations like this bank has this community. Come and join us over there.
Yeah, and that whole model of host reads, which something that has been going on for a long time, came from radio in many ways.
Yeah.
Where the hosts, because podcasts, when you're listening to them, it's harder to fast forward because of the way that you listen to them. The ads are delivered by the people you trust who are the hosts of the podcast, that format, which has been around for a while, seems super effective. What are you seeing on that, Timi, and what you see with your podcast that you work with? And then what other sort of advertising monetization models work?
Oh, brands love it. And I think because everyone understands it, then it's not a difficult thing for them to execute. And so as long as you have the right show, the right creators, partnered with the right brands, most of the time, like Daniel says, it's a very collaborative experience. And now with a lot more technology in place, you're not having to bake ads into your sponsorship into your show. So you have a podcast, you have a podcast. If you baked your sponsors in, then that inventory is lost forever. And you're basically giving your
lost, but like if a brand is paying for it once and then someone listens
then
to
you
it,
have it for like
3 months from now, it's like, wait, I could have had another ad in there.
So our technology means you don't have to worry about that anymore.
So you will do, so this is interesting and important. What you do is you'll take a podcast and there'll be some place where there's an ad to be inserted.
Yeah.
And what happens with the creator is they'll record the ad like they were live. It's like, hey, today we're talking about Audible, and Audible is great, and you've got a discount of 20% if you use my code FRIENDOFJIM. And you'll stitch that right in so it sounds seamless.
Yes.
So that a month from now I can be like, hey, GoDaddy will give you 20% off your hosting. These are basically the clients that we used at Revision 3, my company in 2008, which is why I know them. They may not even be advertising now, but that's the sort of thing you can stitch in, which we couldn't do back in 2008, 2010, even 4 or 5 years ago, right?
Yeah, but the tech has now been around for 7 years. It's called server-side dynamic ad insertion.
By the way, there's a company called Kiptronic that did this in 2007, 2008. My co-host of my podcast, Renee Teely, was there. It didn't really work out. But again, people have been trying to do this. Do you do this auto insertion stuff, Daniel?
Yeah, so we do a couple. So we do bake in as well. But when we do baked in, we make sure that it's entertaining on its own. So like we don't just do reads. We actually write and script like mini skits. And so I think the most recent one was that I think we're promoting a makeup brand. So we did an entire like 60-second like K-drama, like Korean drama kind of like a short story. But yeah, so we've been working with Acast as well. And I think that the thing that was mind-blowing to me was that the exact same episode a week later might have a different ad within it, but so seamless. And we get to monetize, so we're not complaining for sure.
Yeah, and so talk about the CPMs or the value of monetization of these ads. I mean, we know that when you trust somebody and they tell you to do something, you're more likely to do it. And so using those codes and doing that. Is it performance-based? Is it CPM-based? Is it a mixture of each? And at what level? I mean, can you make a bunch of money on a podcast? Timi, talk about that for a minute.
Majority right now is still CPM-based because a lot of brands see it as part of their brand building arsenal. And also because podcasts are great and they're engaging, but they're still not at the level, let's say, of YouTube inventory or TikTok inventory. So it's it's like the CPMs are higher, but we're not going to tell you to move away from everything else because the volume is different. So you kind of, as a creator, you just have to balance that out and do the math yourself and make your own decisions around where you want to be. But in terms of performance, there's a lot of tech that's out now that allows you to do better attribution. There's a tool called PodSites, podsites.com. Anyone can create an account, and that allows you to attribute.
Oh, cool. Attribution's super important,
for
so that's great.
podcasts specifically, yeah.
But do you make more money off video or audio? You don't have to answer that, but I had to ask.
Definitely video for now, but that's only because we've just recently moved to Acast. So before this, we weren't monetizing on audio.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, right?
All right, so let's talk a little bit about creators for a minute. And you're a creator, and you've been doing video. You know, a lot of the themes of this show is around alternate monetization for creators, so you're not just relying on your YouTube AdSense, as we need to figure out other ways for creators to get paid. Why should a creator get started, and what should they expect? Timi, I'm going to start with you. Why should a creator in video or on another platform do a podcast? Who's going to be successful, and what should they expect in growing it? And, you know, are they going to make millions on their podcast in, you know, week 6?
Not week 6. Oh, actually, some do well off the bat. If you're like, say, the Daily Ketchup, and you already have an audience elsewhere, and you realize that your audience can get value from you in a podcast format, then definitely go and do it. Like we have like podcasters who started out in video. There's one who's an English language teacher. He has 1.5 million listeners a month. And so not only can he now help kind of build his business on podcasts too, because language learning is pretty useful in audio, but he can also now turn on paid subscriptions.
Got it. So it becomes a funnel for other things. Yeah.
Which may not be as easy to do. Your revenue streams open up. So you can study it, decide whether you can port your content from one channel to another directly, or do something different that you know your community will want.
Yeah, what are you finding, and what's your recommendation for creators who are thinking about this? So there's some tips and tricks in getting started, things to think about, ways you can move people around, Daniel, that you've used.
Yeah, no, before that, I just want to address that same question, because I think the reason why creators, if you're not doing podcasts yet, I think if you're doing skits or if you're doing vlogs, like there's a lot of pre-production that comes with it, and I think that should continue. But with podcasts, in order to get that cadence, it's a low barrier. You're able to create something like 1 a week or 2 a week with very low barriers to entry. And I think if you're someone that relies on YouTube AdSense, for example, that cadence would definitely see your YouTube revenue increase. For us, across our different media brands, the Daily Ketchup is the one that we've gotten the most inbound inquiries for, just because of how frequent we're able to post. I think on our other shows, it was always either once every 2 weeks or sometimes even once every month, which is not very like frequent. I think the other reason as well is because you can skin the entire cow. Sorry if you're vegan, but like you can essentially use the entire coconut, because a podcast, you get to have the full version of it, and you can put it out on YouTube, and you can put it out on audio, and then you can create cut downs and put it on TikTok and create an Instagram Reels or a YouTube Shorts. And we know people who only watch our TikToks and have maybe never watched the entire full version. But one full version, you could have 10 different TikTok clips from that.
You brought it up in an interesting thing. I really want to quickly talk about how often you should do it, because my sense and my opinion, which is probably wrong, but is that, you know, we're creatures of habit. We do things weekly. That's my weekly show I got to watch, or daily. I got to listen to it daily. Is that the right frequency? What do you see as the right frequency? Because I think you're right. If it's monthly or something, or it's not on a cadence, people will forget and not listen. But am I right? Am I wrong? Timi, what do you see? Daniel, what do you think?
There's no like hard and fast rule, but we can tell you what won't help you grow. Monthly or limited series is a bit hard. Even like the best publishers who have the most amazing limited series, they still have to do a lot of work to keep promoting it. And if it's not evergreen, then at some point, people will just stop listening. So, you know, some kind of cadence. Like weekly, I would say, is the most common. If you can do more regularly, great. We've had some shows have success with a lower frequency, but they're super well. They usually go for higher production.
Well known. And
they do higher production. So, you know.
Dan, what do you think?
I think if you create a show that is predictable, so for example, like for us, even though it's called the Daily Ketchup, we actually publish like twice a week. And so it's Thursdays. And
it's called the Daily Ketchup, but it's twice a week. Okay, sure.
It started daily, and then we realized it was just too much work.
But we're not changing the name.
We're not changing the name. And so we publish every Monday and Thursdays, and it's now predictable for our listeners. And I think that's fine. I think if we started off as a weekly show every Monday, I think that's fine as well. It's just that when you first establish yourself, it's just about creating that predictability. So sometimes if we don't publish on a Monday and we publish on a Tuesday, just because post-production took a while, we do have people going, whoa, what's going on? This has messed up my entire week. And sometimes they just don't have time on a Tuesday to listen to the Monday episode. So we try our best to keep it that way.
So real quickly, because we only have about a minute or two left, distribution. there are a lot of places you can put your podcast, from Spotify to YouTube to all these other places. There's Anchor, I mean, you guys are in the business of sending it out there, but how should a podcaster think about where to put this thing to get the best audience and to build the audience?
Be everywhere, for sure, because
How do you be everywhere? Work with you, work with Libsyn or someone else?
Obviously, Libsyn can be your partner. We can be your partner because we distribute everywhere, like Apple Podcast, YouTube, hundreds of other
Work with Timi,
channels
she's
around
great,
the
but
world.
that is what you want to do,
Just
right?
whatever host you choose, make sure they distribute everywhere for you. It shouldn't be a case where you're only on Spotify or only on Apple, because you will never get the 100% of potential listeners that way.
It used to be that Apple was fine because 80 or 85% of the listeners were there, but that is entirely different right now.
And there's a lot more like country-specific, like walled gardens now. Like in Indonesia and India, you have podcast companies that are walled gardens now, and so you kind of have to really find an agnostic distributor.
Okay, real quickly before you go, in 10 words or less, and I'll start Daniel with you, and then Timi, I'll move on to you. What is the one thing in podcasting you're most excited about in 2023?
Oh, definitely monetization. I think, oh no, that's 1 in 10 words. But I think more and more brands are getting more interested in the space just because the audience is growing as well. And so more business is always great because we get to do what we love doing.
Brands going where the audience is. It's an old story, but I think you're right. Timi, what do you think?
I'm pretty excited about the fact that there will be a podcast for any passion or interest that people want. That's certainly already happening, so that will
Whatever you like, there'll be a podcast for you. All right, you guys, Dan, Timi, thank you so much. That's where podcasting is. Next year, live on stage, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jasper.